Hello, my friends, and welcome to this journey into the shadows of history. I'm so glad you're here, joining me to uncover the forgotten truths of a time long past. Before we dive into the dark and bloody world of medieval Scandinavia, I want to know where you are right now. Are you sitting cozy in a cafe in London, watching the rain fall outside? Maybe you're in New York, curled up with a blanket as the city hums below. Or perhaps you're in Tokyo, where the early morning light is just breaking over the horizon. Wherever you are, whatever hour it is. Thank you for choosing to walk this path with me, a path that leads into a world of violence, fear, and human strength. This series is all about the Vikings, those fierce warriors from the north whose name still sends shivers down our spines, even 1,000 years later. But let us be clear from the start. This isn't the Vikings you see in movies or TV shows. Those stories often paint them as brave adventurers, noble heroes sailing off in search of glory. The truth is much darker, much bloodier, and far more terrifying. The Vikings weren't just explorers or traders. They were raiders who brought death and destruction to entire communities. Their attacks weren't random adventures. They were carefully planned campaigns of terror that changed the course of history. Tonight, we go into peel back the myths and look at the brutal reality of what the Vikings did, how they did it, and how their actions shaped the world we live in today. If you're fascinated by history's darker corners, by the stories that don't make it into fairy tales, then you're in the right place. I invite you to subscribe if you want to keep exploring these grim chapters of humanity with me. Each episode, we'll dig deeper into the past, uncovering the truths that time has buried. For now, let's leave our modern comforts behind, your warm bed, your phone, your safe home, and step into a world where life was fragile. Mercy was rare, and danger could strike at any moment. Picture this. It's a foggy morning in the year 793. Somewhere along the North Sea, the water is calm, almost too calm, with only the soft splash of oars breaking the silence. But those oars belong to no ordinary boats. These are Viking longships, their carved dragon heads cutting through the mist like monsters rising from the deep. On board, warriors sharpen their axes, check their armor, and stare at the distant shore. They're not fishermen or traders. They're hunters, and their prey is the peaceful villages and monasteries just waking up to the new day. The Vikings. That word alone is enough to make your heart race even today. We've all heard the tales of fearless warriors sailing across stormy seas, their long ships packed with treasures and their hearts full of courage. But let's set those stories aside. The real Vikings were not the heroes of some grand adventure. They were men who brought terror to anyone unlucky enough to cross their path. For nearly 300 years, from the late 700s to the early 1000s, these Norse raiders swept out of Scandinavia like a storm. They attacked without warning, struck with horrifying precision, and vanished back into the sea, leaving behind burned villages, broken lives, and a fear that lingered for generations. Imagine living in a small coastal village during that time. You wake up to the sound of birds, maybe the distant ringing of church bells as monks begin their morning prayers. You feel safe, surrounded by the familiar routines of your life. Then, out of the fog, you see them dark shapes on the water, moving closer. By the time you realize what's happening, it's too late. The Vikings are here, and they bring death with them. Monasteries are set ablaze, their sacred books and treasures stolen or destroyed. Families are torn apart, with men killed, women and children taken as slaves, and homes reduced to ash. Entire communities disappear overnight, their people either dead or dragged away to far-off lands. This wasn't just one attack. It happened again and again, year after year, across the coasts of Europe. So why did the Vikings do this? What made ordinary men farmers, fishermen, fathers turn into such ruthless raiders? And how did their actions change the world? That's what we're here to explore. This series isn't just about battles or loot. It's about the clash between two worlds, the peaceful communities of medieval Europe and the relentless violence of the Viking raiders. It's about how fear became a weapon more powerful than any sword, how entire societies were forced to change to survive, and how the scars of those raids still echo in our world today. Let's start with the Vikings themselves. They came from the cold, rugged lands of Scandinavia, modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. These were places of harsh winters, rocky soil, and limited resources. For many, survival meant looking beyond their shores. Some Vikings were traders, sailing to distant lands to exchange furs, amber, and weapons. Others were explorers, charting new lands as far away as North America. But the ones we're talking about today were raiders, men who saw violence as a way to gain wealth, power, and status. To them, raiding wasn't just a job, it was a way of life, a path to honor in a culture that valued strength above all else. Their longships were the key to their success. These weren't just boats. They were marvels of engineering, fast and sturdy enough to cross stormy seas, yet light enough to sail up shallow rivers. With their carved prows and rows of oars, longships could appear out of nowhere, strike hard, and disappear before anyone could fight back. On board, Viking warriors were armed to the teeth axes, swords, spears, and shields, their bodies protected by chainmail or leather. They weren't just strong. They were smart, planning their attacks with care. They knew exactly where to strike monasteries full of gold, villages with no defenses, trading posts loaded with goods. They didn't just want loot. They wanted to break the spirit of their enemies, to make entire regions live in fear of their return. And fear was their greatest weapon. The Vikings didn't just attack. They made sure everyone knew how terrifying they were. They burned churches, tortured prisoners, and left bodies where they'd be found, all to spread panic. Stories of their cruelty traveled faster than their ships, making villages surrender without a fight. Imagine hearing that a nearby town was destroyed, its people killed or enslaved. You'd know the Vikings could come for you next. And that fear would change how you lived, always watching the sea, always ready to run. This wasn't just violence, it was psychological warfare, designed to make people feel helpless. The impact of these raids went far beyond the immediate destruction. When the Vikings attacked a monastery, they weren't just stealing gold, they were destroying centers of learning, burning books that held centuries of knowledge. When they burned a village, they weren't just taking lives, they were wiping out entire communities, forcing survivors to abandon their homes. When they took slaves, they weren't just stealing people, they were tearing apart families, selling men, women, and children to markets as far away as the Middle East. The Vikings didn't just attack, they reshaped the world, forcing Europe to become a place where defense came first, where trust was rare, and where survival meant adapting to a new kind of danger. But this story isn't just about the Vikings. It's about the people who faced them, the monks praying in their stone churches, farmers working their fields, the children playing by the shore. These were ordinary people just like us, whose lives were turned upside down in moments of unimaginable terror. Behind every burned village, every stolen treasure, every enslaved person, there were real human stories of loss and survival. The Vikings left behind sagas and artifacts, but their victims left only silence, their pain written in the ashes of their homes, their stories lost to history. As we dive into this series, we'll walk through these moments of horror and resilience. We'll stand with the monks of Lindisfarne as they see Viking sails on the horizon. We'll witness the destruction of communities that had known peace for generations. We'll explore the dark psychology that turned men into monsters and the incredible strength of those who survived. This isn't just a story of axes and longships, some story of how fear and violence can change entire societies, how people adapt to live under constant threat, and how the echoes of that terror shaped the foundations of medieval Europe. We'll also look at what came after the raids, when the Vikings settled in the lands they once attacked. Their brutality didn't just vanish, it became part of the systems that replaced it, like the feudal order that trapped peasants in a different kind of suffering. We'll meet people like Duncan Loud, fictional peasant whose story shows the grinding poverty and oppression of medieval life, a life shaped by the same forces of violence and power that the Vikings brought. Through these stories, we'll see how the legacy of Viking raids lived on, not just in burned villages, but in the way people thought, lived, and survived. This journey will take us deep into the darkness of human history, where honor and horror walked side by side, where the line between civilization and savagery was razor thin. The Vikings weren't monsters in the way we might imagine they were men, shaped by their culture, their beliefs, and their world, but their actions left scars that changed Europe forever. By understanding their story, we learn something about ourselves, about what humans are capable of, both in cruelty and in courage. So, settle in, my friends. Turn down the lights. Let the modern world fade away, and prepare to step into a time when every dawn could bring danger, when every sail on the horizon could mean death. This is the brutal reality of Viking raids, a tale of terror, survival, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Let's begin. So, my friends, we've left our modern world behind and stepped into a foggy morning in 793, standing on the shores of the North Sea. The air is heavy with mist, the water lapping quietly against the rocky coast. In the distance, you hear the faint toll of monastery bells calling monks to their morning prayers. Everything feels calm, peaceful even, like any other day in a small coastal village. But then, something changes. The mist shifts, and dark shapes appear on the waterlong, sleek ships with carved dragon heads glaring through the fog. The Vikings are here, and the world you know is about to change forever. Let's dive into the first wave of their onslaught, a storm of violence that swept across medieval Europe and left it trembling. These weren't just random attacks by a few reckless warriors. The Viking raids that began in the late 700s were like a tidal wave, crashing over the coasts of Europe with terrifying force. For nearly 300 years, from the late 8th century to the early 11th century, these Norse raiders struck villages, monasteries, and towns from Ireland to France, from England to the edges of the Mediterranean. They came from the cold, rugged lands of Scandinavian Norway, Sweden, Denmark, where life was tough and the sea was their road to survival. Their longships, those incredible wooden vessels, could sail across stormy oceans or glide up shallow rivers, letting them strike deep into the heart of lands that thought they were safe. Imagine living in a village miles from the coast, thinking the sea could never reach you, only to wake up to the sound of Viking war cries echoing through your valley. Let's picture that first famous raid, the one that shocked the world and marked the start of the Viking Age. It's June 8th, 793, and we're on the tiny island of Lindisfarne, off the northeast coast of England. This place is holy, a monastery where monks spend their days praying, copying sacred books, and crafting treasures of gold and silver. To the people of the time, Lindisfarne is a beacon of faith and learning, a safe haven in a world that can be harsh. But on this morning, the sea brings something else. Through the fog, Viking longships slide onto the shore, their oars moving in perfect rhythm. The monks busy with their prayers don't see them coming. The villagers nearby, tending to their fishing nets, don't hear the creak of wood or the clink of weapons. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, the Vikings are already upon them. These warriors aren't what you might expect from the movies. They're not all towering giants with flowing beards, though some might look like that. They're men of all kinds, farmers, fishermen, craftsmen who've left their homes to seek wealth and glory. Their faces are weathered from years at sea, their hands calloused from wielding axes and swords. They wear simple tunics, some with chainmail or leather armor, and carry round wooden shields painted with bold colors. Their weapons are practical but deadly: sharp iron axes, spears for thrusting, and swords for those wealthy enough to own them. They move with purpose, not chaos, each man knowing his role as if they've rehearsed this moment 100 times. And they have. These raids aren't random, they're planned with care, like a hunter stalking prey. As the Vikings storm Lindisfarne, the scene is one of pure terror. The monks, caught in the middle of their prayers, try to flee, but there's nowhere to go. The raiders move fast, surrounding the monastery to cut off escape routes. Some warriors guard the ships, ready to sail away at a moment's notice. Others spread out, blocking paths to the mainland. And then there are the ones who lead the attack, the fiercest of the group, maybe even berserkers, warriors who fight with a wild, almost supernatural intensity. These men don't just kill, they make sure the killing is seen, heard, and remembered. They want the story of this day to spread, to make every village in England tremble at the thought of Viking sails. The monastery doesn't stand a chance. The Vikings smash through wooden doors, their axes splintering oak like it's kindling. They drag monks from their hiding places, killing some on the spot and tying others up to be sold as slaves. The treasures of Lindisfarne, golden crosses, silver chalices, Jeweled book covers are ripped from altars and stuffed into sacks. Sacred books, painstakingly copied by hand over years, are thrown into fires or torn apart. The Vikings don't care about the words on the pages. To them, the parchment is just kindling. The gold is what matters. By the time they leave, the monastery is a smoking ruin, its walls stained with blood, its sacred spaces defiled. The survivors, if there are any, are left to pick up the pieces, their faith shaken, their world turned upside down. This raid on Lindisfarne was indeed just a single act of violence. It was a signal to the world that nowhere was safe. The news spread like wildfire, carried by terrified survivors and whispered in every village and town. People who had never seen a Viking began to fear them, imagining the dragon ships lurking just beyond the horizon. And they were right to be afraid. Lindisfarne was only the beginning. Over the next few decades, Viking raids grew in number and boldness. They hit monasteries in Ireland, like the Great Abbey at Iona. They struck villages along the coasts of France, burning settlements along the Seine River. They even sailed as far as Spain and the Mediterranean, attacking Muslim and Christian towns alike. No place was too far, no target too small. What made these raids so terrifying was how unpredictable they were. Like wars between kings, where armies marched in open fields and battles had rules, Viking attacks came out of nowhere. One day you're tending your crops or fishing in the harbor. The next, your village is gone, your family dead or enslaved. The Vikings didn't follow the seasons or patterns of traditional warfare. They could strike in spring, summer, or even the dead of winter, when people least expected it. Their long ships let them move fast, hitting a target and vanishing before anyone could organize a defense. Coastal communities lived in constant fear, never knowing when the next attack might come. The Vikings weren't just after gold or silver, though they took plenty of that. They wanted everything of value: tools, weapons, food, livestock, and, most chillingly, people. Slavery was a big part of their raids. Men, women, and children were chained and dragged to the ships, destined for slave markets in places like Dublin, Constantinople, or even Baghdad. A strong young man could be sold to work in fields or mines. A woman might end up as a servant or worse in a Viking household. Children, small and easy to control, were valuable because they could be raised to obey. The Vikings didn't just destroy lives, they stole them, tearing families apart and scattering people across the world. Let's take a moment to imagine what it was like for those caught in a raid. Picture a young woman named Elfric, living in a small English village. She's helping her mother bake bread when she hears shouts from the shore. She runs outside, thinking it's a neighbor calling for help, but instead she sees men with axes pouring from strange boats. Her father grabs a pitchfork to fight, but he's cut down before he can swing it. Elfric tries to run, but a Viking grabs her, tying her wrists with rough rope. She's dragged to a ship, her mother's screams fading behind her. For weeks, she's kept in the dark hold of a longship, cold and hungry, not knowing where she's going. Eventually, she's sold in a noisy market far from home, her old life gone forever. Stories like Elfric's happen thousands of times, each one a tragedy that left scars on entire communities. The Vikings' success came from their skill and planning. They didn't just attack blindly, they scouted their targets, learning where the riches were and when defenses were weak. They timed their raids for moments of vulnerability, like religious festivals when people gathered in churches, or harvest time when villages were busy in the fields. They knew how to use the land, sailing up rivers to hit inland towns, or landing on beaches where no one expected an attack. Their longships were fast and light, carrying up to 60 warriors, but they could also be carried over land to bypass obstacles. This made the Vikings unstoppable, appearing in places that thought they were safe. But it wasn't just their ships or weapons that made them so feared. It was their mindset. To the Vikings, raiding was honorable, a way to prove their courage and bring wealth to their families. Back in Scandinavia, a successful raider was a hero, celebrated with feasts and songs. A man who came home with gold, slaves, or stories of victory was respected, his family's status raised. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake, it was a way of life, rooted in a culture that valued strength and survival. Yet for their victims, this mindset was terrifying. The Vikings didn't see their enemies as people with lives and families. They saw them as targets, obstacles to be overcome. The impact of these raids went beyond the immediate destruction. When the Vikings attacked a place like Lindisfarne, they didn't just steal treasure, they shook the foundations of medieval Europe. Monasteries were more than just churches. They were centers of learning, where monks preserved ancient knowledge and taught the next generation. When those places burned, entire libraries were lost, books that could never be replaced. Villages that were attacked often never recovered, their people fleeing inland or dying of starvation when their crops and livestock were gone. The fear of Viking raids changed how people lived, forcing them to build walls, abandon coastal homes, and live in constant watchfulness. This was the Viking onslaught, a wave of violence that swept across Europe, leaving behind a trail of ash and fear. It wasn't just about the battles or the loot, it was about how these raids changed the way people saw the world. Communities that once felt safe now lived in dread. Kings and lords who once focused on building wealth now poured everything into defense. And ordinary people like Elfric faced horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As we move forward in this series, we'll dig deeper into how the Vikings planned their attacks, how they used fear as a weapon, and how their actions reshaped Europe for centuries. For now, hold on to that image of those dragon ships cutting through the fog, a sign that the world was about to change forever. The dragon ships slipped back into the fog, their oars slicing through the water as silently as they arrived. Behind them, the shores of Lindisfarne burn, the cries of the survivors fading into the wind. The Vikings have struck, leaving a monastery in ruins, a village shattered, and a message carved in blood. Nowhere is safe. But what made this raid and the hundreds like it so terrifying wasn't just the violence. It was the way the Vikings planned every move, every cut, every scream, with chilling precision. This wasn't chaos or madness. It was calculated brutality, a machine of destruction built to break bodies, minds, and entire communities. Let's step closer, my friends, and see how the Vikings turned terror into an art form, making their raids far more than just a grab for gold. Imagine standing on that smoldering shore, the air thick with smoke and the stench of blood. The Vikings didn't just attack and leave, they worked like a team with a plan, each man knowing his role as if they'd rehearsed it 100 times. And they had. These raids weren't random outbursts of violence. They were carefully organized, like a hunt where every step was mapped out. As the longships hit the beach, some warriors tied the boats to the shore, ready for a quick getaway. Others fanned out, circling the village or monastery to block every escape route. Then came the strike team, the men who brought the nightmare to life. This wasn't a wild mob. It was a disciplined unit, each part moving in sync to maximize destruction and fear. Let's picture a raid on a small monastery, maybe one like Iona in Scotland, a few years after Lindisfarne. It's dawn, the monks quietly chanting in their stone chapel, their candles casting soft light on golden relics. Nearby, villagers milk cows and stack firewood, unaware of the danger creeping closer. The Vikings have been watching this place, maybe for days. They've learned the monastery holds silver and jewels, that the village has food and tools, and that no soldiers guard the area. They've chosen this moment early morning when people are tired and defenses are low. When they strike, it's not a blind rush. They move with purpose, every action designed to overwhelm and terrify. The first wave of Vikings doesn't just charge in, they set the stage. They shout war cries, loud and guttural, banging their shields to create a wall of sound that freezes people in place. They light fires at the edge of the village, letting smoke and flames sow panic before the real attack begins. This isn't just about fighting, it's about breaking the will of everyone in their path. They want the monks to drop their prayer books, the villagers to scatter instead of fight. Leading the charge are the fiercest warriors, maybe even berserkers. These aren't the crazed lunatics of legend, but elite fighters trained to channel their strength into a terrifying focus. Stories say some used herbs or rituals to push themselves into a state where pain and fear didn't exist, only the need to kill. When they charged, swinging axes with deadly accuracy, no one could stand against them. But the berserkers were only part of the horror. Even more unsettling were the ordinary Vikings, the farmers, fishermen, and fathers who turned into raiders when the season called. These men didn't fight in a frenzy. They were practical, treating raiding like a trade. They knew how to kill quickly, how to loot efficiently, how to leave a village in ruins with minimal effort. They moved through the monastery like workers, clearing a field, ripping gold crosses from altars, prying jewels from sacred books, and stuffing silver into sacks. Anything valuable, tools, weapons, food, went into the ships. What they couldn't carry, they destroyed. They burned granaries to ensure survivors would starve. They slaughtered livestock, leaving fields soaked in blood. They smashed altars and set fire to manuscripts, not just to loot, but to crush the spirit of the community. To the monks, those books were sacred, the result of years of labor. To the Vikings, they were nothing but kindling. The Vikings didn't stop at destruction, they made examples. They wanted their cruelty to linger, to spread fear far beyond the village they attacked. They might spare a few people, not out of mercy, but to send them running to the next town, sobbing about what they'd seen. They might perform gruesome acts, like the Blood Eagle, where a victim's ribs were carved to look like wings, a ritual, so horrific it became legend. This wasn't just murder. It was a message. Fight us, and this is your fate. Children faced the worst of their brutality. The Vikings knew that hurting a child would break a parent's heart, making entire communities surrender without a fight. A mother watching her son dragged to a ship would beg for mercy, offering anything to save him. A father seeing his daughter chained would carry that pain forever, spreading the Vikings' reputation with every trembling word. This was psychological warfare, and the Vikings were masters at it. Fear was their sharpest weapon, more powerful than any sword. Before they even landed, their reputation arrived, carried by tales of burned villages and tortured monks. Villages surrendered just hearing the Vikings were near, knowing resistance was futile. The Vikings cultivated this fear deliberately. They left bodies where they'd be found, displayed in ways that would haunt survivors. They burned churches not just for loot, but to shake the faith of entire regions. To Christians, a church was God's house, a place of safety. When the Vikings defiled it, they sent a message. Even your God can't protect you. This fear spread like wildfire, making every coastal village watch the sea, dreading the sight of a dragon-headed ship. The Vikings' economic strategy was just as calculated. They didn't just grab whatever they could, they targeted what would hurt the most. Monasteries were their favorite targets, not just for gold, but because they were the heart of medieval communities. Places like Lindisfarne and Iona held wealth, yes, but they were also centers of learning and faith. By looting and burning them, the Vikings didn't just steal treasure, they crippled entire regions. They targeted granaries and mills to cut off food supplies, ensuring survivors faced starvation. They stole tools and seeds, making it impossible for farmers to rebuild. They took livestock, leaving villages without milk, meat, or the means to plow fields. Every choice was designed to leave communities broken, unable to recover. Slavery was a key part of their plan. The Vikings didn't just kill, they captured. Men, women, and children were tied up and dragged to the ships, destined for slave markets in places like Dublin or far off Constantinople. A strong man could be sold to work in fields or mines. A woman might become a servant or face worse fates in a Viking household. Children were especially valuable, small enough to control and young enough to be raised as loyal workers. The Vikings didn't see these people as families with lives. They saw them as goods, as profitable as gold. A single raid could net dozens of captives, each one sold for a high price, fueling the Viking economy back home. This wasn't just theft, it was a system, a business built on human suffering. Let's imagine a young boy named Edric, caught in one of these raids. He's playing by the river when the Vikings strike his village. His father tries to fight swinging a hoe, but he's cut down in seconds. Edric runs, his heart pounding, but a Viking grabs him, tying his wrists with rope that bites into his skin. He's thrown into the dark hold of a long ship, surrounded by other captives, their sobs mixing with the creak of the boat. For weeks, he's cold, hungry, and terrified, not knowing where he's going. Finally, he's sold in a noisy market, far from home, to a stranger who speaks a language he doesn't understand. His old life, his family, his village, his freedom's gone. Stories like Edric's happened thousands of times, each one a wound that never healed. The Vikings' success came from their precision. They scouted targets carefully, learning where the wealth was and when defenses were weak. They struck during festivals, when people gathered in churches, or at harvest time, when villages were distracted. They used their longship's speed to hit and run, vanishing before anyone could fight back. They knew how to navigate rivers, landing deep inland where no one expected them. Their raids were like lightning fast, deadly, and gone before the thunder came. But what made them truly terrifying was their mindset. To the Vikings, raiding was honorable, a way to prove their strength and bring wealth to their families. Back in Scandinavia, a successful raider was a hero, welcomed with feasts and songs. A man who returned with gold, slaves, or tales of victory was respected, his family's status raised. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a way of life, rooted in a culture that saw strength as survival. Yet for their victims, this mindset was monstrous. The Vikings didn't see their enemies as people with dreams and fears. They saw them as targets, obstacles to overcome. This detachment let them kill without hesitation, loot without remorse, and enslave without pity. Their brutality wasn't wild or reckless. It was cold, calculated, and devastatingly effective. As we move forward, we'll see how this violence left scars not just on bodies, but on entire societies, changing how people lived, thought, and survived. For now, hold on to that image of the Vikings moving through a burning village, their axes gleaming, their faces calm, as they turn terror into a tool sharper than any blade. The flames crackle as the Vikings move through the burning village, their axes gleaming in the firelight, their faces calm and focused. The air is thick with smoke, the ground littered with broken tools, shattered pottery, and the bodies of those who tried to fight or flee. The longships are loaded with gold, silver, and sobbing captives, ready to vanish back into the sea. But as the Vikings row away, leaving a trail of ash and despair, the real story begins, not the story of their victory, but the story of the people left behind. This is where we turn our eyes, my friends, to the human cost of their raids, to the lives shattered, the hearts broken, and the scars that lingered long after the flames died out. Let us walk through the wreckage and see what the Vikings' calculated brutality meant for those who faced it. Imagine standing in that village as the Vikings depart. The silence is heavy, broken only by the sobs of survivors and the creak of collapsing timbers. The monastery, once a place of prayer and peace, is a smoldering ruin, its sacred relics gone, its books burned to ash. The fields are trampled, the granaries destroyed, the livestock slaughtered or stolen. Homes that stood for generations are gone, reduced to blackened beams. But the worst loss isn't the gold or the grain, it's the people, us. Some lie dead, their bodies left where they fell, a grim warning to others. Others are gone, dragged to the ships, their fates unknown. Those who remain are left to pick up the pieces, their world turned upside down in a single morning. Let's picture a woman named Sinberg, a weaver in this village. Just hours ago, she was laughing with her daughter, teaching her to spin wool. Now, her husband lies dead in the dirt, his throat cut as he tried to protect their home. Her daughter, only 10 years old, was tied up and dragged to a longship, her screams fading as the Vikings sailed away. Sinberg is alive, but her hands tremble as she kneels beside her husband's body, her mind replaying the moment she couldn't save her child. She doesn't know if her daughter is alive, where she's going, or what horrors she faces. The pain is a weight she'll carry forever, a wound that no amount of time can heal. Stories like Sinberg's weren't rare. They were the reality for thousands of people across Europe. From Ireland to France, as Viking raids tore communities apart. The immediate devastation of a raid was staggering. Villages that took years to build were destroyed in hours. Homes, barns, and churches were burned, leaving survivors with no shelter, no food, no way to start over. The Vikings didn't just take what was valuable, they destroyed what was essential. They burned crops and granaries, ensuring starvation for those left behind. They killed livestock, leaving families without milk, meat, or the means to plow fields. They smashed tools and stole seeds, making it impossible for survivors to rebuild. A single raid could wipe out a community's ability to survive the next winter, turning thriving villages into ghost towns. Some places never recovered, their names lost to history, their people scattered or dead. But the physical destruction was only part of the human cost. The psychological toll was even deeper, a wound that didn't show but never stopped bleeding. Survivors like Sinberg didn't just lose their homes or loved ones, they lost their sense of safety, their trust in the world. Imagine living through a raid, hiding in the woods as your village burns, hearing the screams of your neighbors. Even if you survive, the fear stays with you. Every creak in the night, every shadow on the horizon becomes a Viking ship coming back to finish the job. People today might call this trauma, maybe even PTSD, but back then, there was no name for it, just a heavy, gnawing dread that never went away. Entire communities lived in this state of constant fear, always watching the sea, always ready to run. For those taken captive, the nightmare was just beginning. The Vikings were ruthless in their slave trade, seeing people as nothing more than goods to be sold. Men, women, and children were tied with ropes, packed into the dark, damp holds of longships, and shipped to markets across Europe and beyond. The journey itself was brutal weeks at sea, cold and hungry, with no idea where you were going or if you'd survive. Let's imagine a boy named Wulfric, a farmer's son from a coastal village. He's 15, strong from working the fields, when the Vikings attack. His father is killed, his mother taken, and Wulfric is chained and thrown into a ship. The hold is crowded, the air thick with the smell of sweat and fear. He's given barely enough food to stay alive, his wrists raw from the ropes. After weeks of misery, he's sold in a market in Dublin, a city he's never heard of, to a Viking chieftain who needs laborers. His life as a farmer's son is gone, replaced by back-breaking work and the constant threat of punishment. Women and children faced even worse fates. Women like Sinberg's daughter were often sold as servants or concubines, their lives defined by labor and abuse. Children were prized because they could be molded into obedient workers, raised to serve their new masters. The Vikings didn't care about the families they tore apart. They saw only profit. A single raid could net dozens of captives, each one sold for silver in markets, as far away as Constantinople or Baghdad. The scale of this trade was staggering, with thousands of people ripped from their homes and scattered across the world. These weren't just numbers. They were people with names, dreams, and stories, reduced to property in the Vikings' brutal economy. The unpredictability of the raids made the human cost even heavier. Unlike wars where armies marched in open fields, Viking attacks came without warning. One day you're tending your sheep or praying in church. The next, your world is gone. The Vikings could strike any time, spring, summer, even winter, when people thought the seas were too rough for sailing. Their longships let them hit anywhere, from remote islands to inland towns along rivers. This randomness kept entire regions on edge. Villagers built watchtowers, scanned the horizon, and whispered prayers every time a strange sail appeared. Children grew up hearing stories of Viking terror, learning to fear the sea before they could even swim. The constant threat changed how people lived, turning open, trusting communities into fearful, guarded ones. Let's walk through a survivor's day after a raid. Imagine Sinberg again, standing in her ruined village. Her husband is dead, her daughter gone, her home burned. She has no food, no tools, no way to rebuild. She wanders the wreckage, searching for anything to salvage: a scrap of cloth, a broken pot, a crust of bread. She finds other survivors, their faces pale with shock, their hands shaking as they bury the dead. They work together, but there's no laughter, no hope, just a grim determination to survive. At night, Sinberg lies awake, replaying the raid in her mind, the Vikings' axe. Her daughter screams the moment she failed to save her. She wonders if she'll ever see her child again, if she's even alive. Sleep brings no relief, only nightmares of fire and blood. This was the reality for countless survivors, a life where grief and fear became as constant as breathing. The human cost wasn't just in the moment, it stretched across generations. Families were broken, with parents losing children, children losing parents, and entire communities losing their future. Villages that were attacked often shrank or vanished, their people fleeing inland or dying of hunger and cold. Those who stayed faced a new kind of struggle, rebuilding with nothing but their hands and their will. But even as they rebuilt, the fear remained. Every stranger could be a Viking scout, every storm a sign of ships on the horizon. This fear shaped how people thought, how they prayed, how they raised their children, turned neighbors into suspects, opened shores into danger zones. The Vikings' brutality didn't just destroy bodies, it destroyed trust, hope, and the belief that life could be safe. Survivors like Sinberg carried their trauma silently, with no words to describe it, no way to heal. Their stories were rarely written down, their pain buried under the weight of survival. Yet they endured, finding ways to keep going despite the loss. They buried their dead, rebuilt their homes, and held on to small acts of humanity: a shared meal, a kind word, a moment of prayer. These acts, small as they were, showed the strength of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable horror. As we move forward, we'll see how this human cost rippled outward, changing not just individual lives but entire societies. The Vikings' raids didn't just leave scars, they reshaped Europe, forcing people to build walls, rethink their faith, and live in a world where violence was never far away. For now, hold on to the image of Sinberg standing in the ashes of her village, her eyes fixed on the sea, searching for a daughter she may never see again. This is the human cost of the Viking raids, a story of loss, fear, and the quiet strength of those who survived. Sinberg stands in the ashes of her village, her eyes fixed on the sea where her daughter disappeared with the Viking longships. The smoke still rises from the ruins, curling into the sky like a grim reminder of everything lost. Hope. But the devastation left behind isn't just personal. The Vikings didn't just take lives and captives, they tore apart the very foundations of the communities they attacked. Places like Lindisfarne, Iona, or Jarrow weren't just churches, they were the beating hearts of medieval society. Monasteries were where people turned for hope, guidance, and safety. When the Vikings burned them, they didn't just steal wealth, they shattered faith. This wasn't just a human tragedy, it was an economic disaster. After a Viking raid destroys his home port, his boats are gone, his goods stolen, and his family enslaved. He tries to start over, but the trade routes he relied on are too dangerous now. Other merchants have fled, markets are empty, and no one has money to buy what little he has left. He's proud of his work, believing it honors God and preserves wisdom for future generations. When the Vikings raid his monastery, they tear the pages apart, using them to light fires. Aldred survives, hiding in the marshes, but when he returns, his life's work is ash. He feels not just loss but betrayal, wondering why God let this happen. His story was common monks, scribes and artisans across Europe watched their creations destroyed, their purpose stolen. This wasn't just a loss of art, it was a loss of hope, a wound to the soul of a culture. Lefwin's livelihood is gone, and with it, the network of trade that kept his region alive. Stories like his played out across Europe, as Viking raids choked off the flow of goods and wealth, pushing communities into a cycle of poverty and survival. Entire villages lost their workforce. Farmers who plowed fields, weavers who made cloth, blacksmiths who forged tools. Monasteries weren't just rich, they were the keepers of knowledge in a world where few could read or write. Monks spent their lives copying books, preserving stories, laws, and science from ancient Rome and Greece. When the Vikings burned these manuscripts, they destroyed centuries of learning. Imagine a library today going up in flames now. Imagine that library holds the only copies of books that exist. That's what happened when the Vikings struck. Entire works of history, philosophy, and religion were lost forever, leaving gaps in human knowledge that we still feel today. Scholars call this a kind of dark age, not because people were ignorant, but because so much was destroyed that future generations had to start over. A single raid could take dozens of people, leaving communities too small to function. When the Vikings looted or burned these, they erased pieces of culture that defined entire regions. A jeweled cross wasn't just beautiful, it was a symbol of faith, connection to God. When it was stolen or melted down, it left a spiritual void. Villagers who once gathered to admire these works now had nothing to rally around. Their sense of identity weakened. The Vikings didn't just take objects, they took meaning, leaving communities to rebuild not just their homes but their sense of who they were. In some areas, so many were taken that fields went unplanted, harvests rotted, and villages starved. The Vikings sold their captives in markets across Europe and beyond Dublin, Constantinople, even Baghdad, fueling their own wealth while draining the life from the places they attacked. This mass removal of people changed the demographics of entire regions, leaving coastal areas depopulated and vulnerable. Imagine a monk watching his life's work, a book he spent decades writing, go up in flames. Imagine a villager seeing the church, where they were baptized, reduced to rubble. These acts sent a message. Nothing is sacred, nothing is safe. The loss of these centers left communities without their spiritual anchors, forcing people to question their beliefs in a world that suddenly felt abandoned by God. These were the banks, libraries, and schools of their time, holding wealth, knowledge, and faith in one place. Viking raids disrupted this system, turning bustling markets into ghost towns. When they burned a village's mill, they took away its ability to grind flour, forcing people to go hungry or flee. When they stole boats and fishing nets, coastal communities lost their way of life. Trade routes along rivers and coasts became too dangerous, as merchants feared Viking ambushes. Towns that once thrived on commerce shrank or disappeared, their people moving inland to escape the threat. This wasn't just a loss of goods, it was a collapse of entire economies, leaving regions poorer and more isolated. Let's go back to Lindisfarne in 793, that first shocking raid that sent tremors across Europe. The monastery was a treasure trove: golden crosses, silver chalices, book covers studded with jewels. The Vikings tore these from altars, stuffing them into sacks to be melted down or sold. But they didn't stop there. They burned the wooden buildings, smashed stone carvings, and threw sacred manuscripts into the fire. To the monks, these books were more than paper. They were the Word of God, copied by hand over years, filled with wisdom from ancient times. To the Vikings, they were worthless, good only for kindling. Their raids were like a storm that didn't just pass through, but left entire regions broken, their economies shattered, their cultures wounded in ways that would take centuries to heal. Let's walk through the wreckage, my friends. See how the Vikings' calculated strikes destroyed not just villages, but the wealth, knowledge, and spirit of medieval Europe. Picture that ruined village again, its fields trampled, its granaries burned, its people scattered or dead. The Vikings didn't just steal gold and silver. They targeted the things that kept communities alive. They knew exactly what to hit to make recovery impossible. When they burned a granary, they weren't just destroying a building. They were taking away the food that would carry a village through winter. When they slaughtered livestock or stole horses, they left farmers without the means to plow fields or feed their families. When they smashed tools and took seeds, they ensured that even the most determined survivors couldn't rebuild easily. This wasn't random destruction, it was economic warfare, designed to leave entire regions starving and helpless. Monasteries were the Vikings' favorite targets, and for good reason. This destruction wasn't just about greed, it was about breaking the soul of a community. The economic damage was just as brutal. Medieval Europe depended on trade, with villages and monasteries acting as hubs where goods like wool, grain, and tools were exchanged. The Vikings' slave trade made things even worse. We talked about captives like Sinberg's daughter and young Wulfric, dragged to longships and sold in far-off markets. Let's imagine a merchant named Leofwin, who once traveled the coasts of England, trading wool for wine and iron. The cultural destruction was even more devastating, because it erased things that couldn't be replaced. The loss went beyond books. Monasteries were also centers of art and craftsmanship. Monks created intricate carvings, illuminated manuscripts, and sacred relics that were the pride of their communities. Let's picture a monk named Aldred, who spent 20 years illuminating a manuscript with colorful designs and tiny, perfect letters. The Vikings' attacks also changed how people saw their world. Before the raids, monasteries were seen as safe havens, places where faith and knowledge were protected. Without monasteries, there were fewer places to teach reading and writing, so literacy dropped. Survivors like Sinberg and Aldred found ways to keep going. The Vikings' raids didn't just break things, they reshaped societies, pushing them toward a more defensive, militarized world. For now, hold on to the image of Aldred kneeling in the ruins of his monastery, clutching a charred page from his manuscript, determined to preserve what little remains of his world's beauty and wisdom. This is the economic and cultural cost of the Viking raids, a loss that went beyond gold and stone, cutting into the heart of what made medieval Europe alive. They buried their dead, salvaged what they could, and rebuilt with whatever was left. They told stories, sang songs, and passed on what little knowledge they could save. These small acts of defiance kept culture alive, even in the face of loss. A villager might carve a simple cross from wood to replace a stolen relic. A monk might memorize a prayer to teach others, even without a book. These efforts, small as they were a refusal to let the Vikings erase everything. Without trade, There was less money to rebuild churches or commission new art. Without people, there was no one to farm the land or carry on traditions. Entire regions became shadows of what they once were, their economies broken, their cultures fragmented. Coastal areas, once vibrant with trade and pilgrimage, became deserted as people fled inland to escape the Vikings' reach. This wasn't just destruction, it was transformation, forcing Europe to adapt to a new reality where survival meant sacrifice. After the Vikings, they became targets, symbols of vulnerability. People began to question the power of the church, wondering why God didn't stop the destruction. This doubt weakened the spiritual glue that held communities together, making them feel abandoned in a world of chaos. Some turned to more militant forms of faith, believing they had to fight to protect what was sacred. Others lost trust in the church entirely, feeling it had failed them when they needed it most. The economic and cultural destruction fed into each other, creating a downward spiral. Yet amidst this devastation, there were glimmers of resilience. As we move forward, we'll see how this destruction forced Europe to change, giving rise to new ways of living, fighting, and believing. Aldred kneels in the ruins of his monastery, his fingers trembling as he clutches a charred page from a manuscript, the last fragment of a world that once felt safe and sacred. The Vikings are gone, their longships vanished into the sea, but the scars they left behind are everywhere: burned buildings, empty villages, and a lingering fear that nothing will ever be the same. The devastation wasn't just about stolen gold or lost lives. It was a spark that set fire to the old ways, forcing medieval Europe to change in ways no one could have imagined. Let's walk through these shattered communities, my friends, and see how the Viking raids didn't just destroy, they transformed society, reshaping how people lived, fought, believed, and survived in a world turned upside down. The Viking raids, which swept across Europe from the late 700s to the early 1000s, were like a storm that broke the foundations of entire regions. Villages once open and trusting became fortified camps. Kings and lords who once dreamed of wealth now focused on defense. Faith that once offered comfort turned into a call to fight. The Vikings didn't just attack, they forced Europe to adapt, creating a new kind of society built to withstand their terror. This transformation touched every part of life, from the way people built their homes to the way they saw their God. Let's start with the most obvious change: the rise of a militarized world, where survival meant being ready for war. Before the Vikings, many communities had little need for armies or walls. Villages along coasts or rivers relied on trade and farming, with only small groups of guards to keep order. Monasteries like Lindisfarne were protected by their sacred status, not by soldiers. But when the Vikings struck, that sense of safety vanished. A single raid could wipe out a village in hours, leaving no time to call for help. People realized they couldn't rely on distant kings or scattered militias. They had to protect themselves. Across Europe, communities began to change. Villages built wooden palisades, then stone walls, turning open settlements into fortified strongholds. Coastal towns moved inland, away from the reach of longships. Watchtowers sprang up along rivers, their lookouts scanning for dragon-headed sails. This militarization wasn't just about walls, it was about people. The Viking threat created a new kind of warrior. Men trained to fight raiders who could strike and vanish in a day. Local lords began to gather armed men not just to defend against Vikings, but to prove their own power. These weren't professional armies, but groups of farmers and craftsmen who learned to wield spears and shields. In places like England and France, kings started organizing militias, demanding every able-bodied man be ready to fight. This shift gave rise to a new warrior class, men whose status came from their skill with a sword rather than their wealth or birth. Villages that once valued peace now celebrated those who could fight, their songs turning from harvests to battles. This need for defense also reshaped how society was organized, giving birth to the feudal system that would define medieval Europe. Before the Vikings, power was often centralized, with kings ruling over large regions. But the raids exposed how weak these systems' workings couldn't protect every village, especially when Vikings could hit anywhere, anytime. Local lords stepped into the gap, offering protection in exchange for loyalty and labor. Farmers and villagers swore allegiance to these lords, working their land and fighting for them when needed. This was the start of feudalism, a system where land and power were tied together, and everyone had a place in a rigid hierarchy: lords at the top, peasants at the bottom, and warriors in between. Let's imagine a farmer named Godric, living in a village near the coast of Francia. Before the Vikings, he answered to a distant king, paying taxes but living freely. After a raid destroys his village, he turns to a local lord for protection. The lord builds a wooden fort, promising safety if Godric works his fields and fights when called. Godric agrees, giving up his freedom for security. His sons train with spears, his crops feed the lord's men, and his life revolves around the fort's walls. This wasn't just a deal, it was a new way of life, one where survival meant loyalty to a local power. Across Europe, this system spread as people traded independence for protection, creating a patchwork of small fortified territories ruled by lords. The Viking raids also changed how people saw their faith. Monasteries, once seen as untouchable, were now targets, their burning a sign that even God's houses weren't safe. This shook the Christian world to its core. Imagine a monk like Aldred, who believed his prayers and manuscripts were protected by divine power. When the Vikings burn his monastery, he wonders why God allowed it. Was it punishment? Was it a test? These questions spread across Europe as people struggled to make sense of the destruction. Some turned to a more militant faith, believing they had to fight to defend God's will. Priests began preaching about holy wars, laying the groundwork for ideas that would later fuel the Crusades. Others saw the raids as a sign of God's anger, pushing them to build stronger churches and pray harder, hoping to win back divine favor. This religious shift had practical effects too. Churches that survived the raids became fortified, their walls thicker, their doors stronger. Monks learned to hide treasures or flee at the first sign of danger. In some places, religious leaders became warriors themselves, trading prayer books for swords. This wasn't just a change in faith, it was a change in how faith was lived. Christianity, once a religion of peace, began to embrace the idea of fighting for survival. Sacred relics were moved inland, away from Viking reach, and new churches were built in safer places. This shift made religion more defensive, more tied to the struggles of a violent world. The demographic changes were just as dramatic. Coastal areas, once thriving with trade and fishing, became ghost towns as people fled inland. Imagine a fishing village in Ireland, its harbor once bustling with boats. After repeated Viking raids, the villagers abandoned their homes, moving to the hills where longships can't reach. Entire regions saw their populations shrink, as people either fled, were killed, or were taken as slaves. This wasn't just a loss of numbers, it changed the map of Europe. Towns moved inland, new settlements grew around fortified castles, and coastal lands were left empty. This shift made Europe more fragmented, with communities turning inward, focusing on survival rather than connection. Trade, once the lifeblood of coastal regions, nearly collapsed. Merchants like Leofwin, whose story we heard in Part 4, couldn't risk sailing where Vikings might strike. Markets that depended on goods from far-off lands dried up, forcing communities to rely on what they could grow or make themselves. This self-sufficiency made Europe more local, less connected, as people stopped trusting the sea. The Vikings' raids didn't just take wealth, they broke the networks that held medieval society together, pushing it toward a more isolated, defensive way of life. Yet even in this transformation there was resilience. People adapted, finding new ways to survive in a world shaped by fear. Lords built stronger castles using stone instead of wood. Farmers learned to hide their crops or rebuild quickly after raids. Monks began copying manuscripts in secret, hiding them in caves or fortified churches. These changes weren't just about survival, they were about defiance, a refusal to let the Vikings win completely. Communities found strength in their new walls, their new warriors, their new faith. They learned to live with fear, turning it into a reason to fight harder, build smarter, and hold on to what mattered. Let's picture Godric again, now living in the shadow of his lord's fort. His life is harder than before, his freedom gone, but he's alive. He teaches his sons to fight, not just to defend their home, but to protect their neighbors. He shares what little food he has with others who lost everything. His wife prays in a new stone church, its walls built to withstand fire. These small acts of training, sharing, praying are the seeds of a new society, one forged in the crucible of Viking raids. Godric's world is different, but it's not broken. Stronger in some ways, built to survive a threat that seemed unstoppable. The Vikings didn't just destroy, they forced Europe to reinvent itself. The walls they made necessary became the foundations of medieval castles. The warriors they inspired became the knights of the feudal age. The faith they challenged grew fiercer, shaping a Christianity that would carry Europe through centuries of conflict. The demographic shifts they caused redrew the map, creating new centers of power and culture. This transformation wasn't easy, it came at a terrible cost, paid in blood, fear, and loss. But it showed the strength of human adaptability, the ability to rebuild even after the worst disasters. As we move forward, we'll see how these changes played out in the lives of ordinary people. Like peasants in portrayed Scotland, who faced new kinds of hardship under the feudal system the Vikings helped create. For now, hold on to the image of Godric standing by his lord's fort, his spear in hand, his eyes scanning the horizon, not just for Vikings, but for a future he's determined to build, no matter the cost. This is the societal transformation of the Viking raids, a story of destruction that gave birth to a new world, one shaped by fear, but strengthened by resilience. Godric stands by his lord's fort, his spear gripped tightly, his eyes scanning the horizon for Viking sails. The world around him has changed. Walls have risen, warriors have replaced farmers, and fear has reshaped his once open village into a guarded stronghold. The Viking raids that tore through Europe didn't just leave ash and ruin. They gave birth to a new order, one where lords rule, peasants serve, and survival comes at a heavy price. Let's leave the burning coasts behind, my friends, and step into the muddy fields of portrayed Scotland, where ordinary people like Godric faced a different kind of brutality, not from Viking axes, but from the feudal system that grew in their shadow. This is the story of peasant life, where hardship was daily, hope was scarce, and yet the human spirit found ways to endure. The Viking raids, which battered Scotland's coasts from the late 700s to the early 1000s, forced communities to adapt in ways that changed them forever. As we saw, villages became fortified, lords gained power, and a feudal system took hold to protect against the Norse threat. But for the peasants, the men, women, and children who worked the land, this new world wasn't a shield. It was a cage. In Scotland, where rugged hills and harsh winters already made life tough, the feudal order piled on new burdens. Peasants like Godric, once free to farm their own land, now answered to lords who demanded their labor, their crops, and their loyalty. The Vikings may have sailed away, but their legacy lived on in a system that trapped people in a different kind of suffering. Let's meet Duncan Loud, a fictional peasant whose story brings this world to life. Duncan is a serf in a small Scottish village in the early 1000s. He's living in the shadow of a lord's stone castle. His home is a one-room hut, its walls made of mud and straw, its roof leaking when it rains. He wakes before dawn, his body aching from yesterday's work, and trudges to the fields to plow the lord's land. Duncan isn't free, he's bound to the land, unable to leave without his lord's permission. Most of his crops go to the castle, leaving him and his family with barely enough to eat. His wife Elias weaves cloth for the lord's household, her fingers raw from spinning. Their children, too young to plow, gather firewood, or tend the few chickens they're allowed to keep. This is their life, day after day, with no end in sight. The feudal system that defined Duncan's world was a direct result of the Viking raids. As lords built forts to protect against raiders, they needed workers to grow food, build walls, and fight when called. In return for protection, peasants like Duncan gave up their freedom, becoming serfs tied to the land. They worked the lord's fields first, only farming their own small plots if time and energy remained. They paid taxes in crops, livestock, or labor, leaving them with little to live on. If the harvest was bad, they starved, while the lord's store stayed full. If Vikings attacked again, Duncan might be handed a spear and told to fight. Untrained and poorly armed, against warriors who'd spent their lives raiding, life for Duncan and his family was a grind of endless toil. Mornings began in the dark, with Duncan hitching a plow to an ox sif. He was lucky enough to have one hand breaking the rocky soil. The work was back-breaking, his hands blistered, his back bent from years of labor. Leah spent her days spinning wool or grinding grain by hand, her work just as exhausting. The children helped where they could, carrying water or chasing birds from the fields. Meals were simple barley porridge, maybe a bit of cheese or a scrap of meat if they were fortunate. Hunger was a constant companion, especially in winter, when food ran low and the cold seeped into their bones. Disease was a threat too, with no medicine or doctors, only prayers to ward off sickness. The church, once a refuge for people like Duncan, became another source of hardship. In the wake of Viking raids, the church grew stronger, building stone cathedrals and demanding tithes a tenth of everything peasants produced. Duncan had to give part of his grain, his wool, even his chickens to the local priest, who sent it to the bishop. The church promised salvation, but to Duncan, it often felt like another lord, taking what little he had. Priests preached about obedience and suffering as God's will, but Duncan wondered why God allowed such misery. The same churches that once offered sanctuary now stood as symbols of power, their wealth a stark contrast to the poverty of the peasants who built them. The Lord's castle loomed over Duncan's life, a constant reminder of his place in the world. The Lord, safe behind stone walls, lived a life Duncan could barely imagine feasting on meat, drinking wine, wearing clothes Elias wove but could never afford. If Duncan failed to pay his taxes or disobeyed, the Lord's men could beat him, take his tools, or throw him in a dungeon. His children could be taken to work in the castle, their lives no longer his to protect. Even justice was out of reach. Disputes were settled by the Lord's word, not fairness. This wasn't just hardship. This was oppression, a system that kept peasants like Duncan trapped, their lives controlled by those above them. Yet, Duncan's life wasn't just about suffering. There were moments of humanity that kept him going. At night, by the flicker of a small fire, Elias told stories to their children, tales of heroes and spirits, passed down from her grandmother. Duncan carved small wooden figures for his son, a horse or a bird, finding joy in the boy's smile. On rare feast days, the village gathered to share what little they had, singing songs and dancing under the stars. These moments were fleeting, but they were lifelines, reminders that even in a world of toil, there was still love, laughter, and hope. Duncan's family clung to these, finding strength in each other when the world offered none. The Viking raids had made this feudal world possible, but they also left a deeper mark on Scotland's peasants. The fear of raids lingered, even as the Norse threat faded. Duncan grew up hearing stories of dragon ships and burned villages told by elders who'd seen the terror firsthand. That fear shaped how he lived, always watching the horizon, always ready to run to the castle if danger came. It also shaped how he saw his lord. The same lords who protected against Vikings now used that power to control, demanding more than they gave. The raids had taught Scotland to value strength, but for peasants, that strength became a chain, tying them to a life of servitude. Social isolation was another burden. For the raids, villages were connected by trade and travel, with people moving freely to markets or festivals. The Viking threat changed that, making travel dangerous and communities wary of strangers. Duncan's village was cut off, its people rarely venturing beyond the fields. Neighbors became both allies and rivals, sharing work but competing for scarce resources. Trust was hard to come by, as every stranger could be a thief or a Viking scout. This isolation made life lonelier, with Duncan and Elias relying only on each other and their children, their world shrinking to the muddy paths of their village. Yet even in this harsh world, resilience shone through. Duncan and his neighbors found ways to endure. They shared tools when one broke, helped rebuild a hut after a storm, or hid a bit of grain from the Lord's collectors to feed a starving family. Elias taught her daughter to weave, passing on skills that gave her a sense of pride. The village priest, despite his tithes, sometimes offered comfort, praying with families who'd lost a child to illness. These small acts of kindness and defiance were a quiet rebellion against a system that tried to strip away their humanity. They showed that even in the darkest times, people could find ways to hold on to hope. The feudal oppression Duncan faced was a direct legacy of the Viking raids. The need for defense created lords who demanded absolute loyalty, turning free farmers into serfs. The church, scarred by Viking attacks, became a power that extracted as much as it gave. The fear of raids lingered, shaping a society where strength and control were valued over freedom and trust. Yet Duncan's story is also one of survival. He worked, loved, and dreamed, even in a world that tried to crush him. Carved toys, aliases stories, their children's laughter, these were acts of resistance. Proof that the human spirit could endure even the heaviest burdens. As we move forward, we'll meet people like Duncan in even darker corners of this feudal world, those at the very bottom, whose lives were defined by the most degrading tasks. For now, hold on to the image of Duncan standing in his field, his hands rough from the plow, his eyes lifted to the sky, finding a flicker of hope in the stars above his small, struggling world. This is peasant life in post-Rod. Scotland, a story of hardship, oppression, and the quiet strength that kept people going, no matter the cost. Duncan Maloud stands in his field, his rough hands gripping the plow, his eyes lifted to the stars twinkling above his small, struggling world. In the quiet of the night, he finds a flicker of hope, a moment of peace amidst the endless toil of his life as a serf in post-trade Scotland. But even Duncan, bound to the land and lord, is not at the bottom of this harsh feudal world. There are others whose lives are even harder, whose days are filled with tasks so degrading they're barely seen as human. Let's step deeper into the shadows, my friends, to meet those on the lowest rungs of society, people like cesspit workers who toiled in filth and faced scorn, yet somehow held onto their humanity in a system built to crush it. This is the story of those the world forgot, living in the aftermath of the Viking raids that shaped their oppressive world. The Viking raids, which battered Scotland's coasts for nearly 3 centuries, didn't just destroy villages, they gave rise to a feudal system that sorted people into rigid layers. At the top were lords, safe in their stone castles, and just below them the church, preaching obedience while collecting tithes. Peasants like Duncan worked the land, their lives hard but tied to the seasons and the hope of a harvest. But at the very bottom were those who did the dirtiest, most despised jobs, tasks so vile that even other peasants looked down on them. These were the cesspit workers, the scavengers, the outcasts who kept society running but were treated like refuse. Their lives were a grim reflection of the feudal order, a system born from the need to survive Viking terror, but hardened into a machine of control and cruelty. Let's return to Duncan Loud. But now imagine him not as a farmer, but as one of these outcasts, a cesspit worker in his lord's castle. Duncan's job is to clean the privies, the stone shafts where the castle's waste collects and stinking pits below. Every day he climbs into these dark, foul-smelling holes, armed with a shovel and a bucket, to scoop out human waste and haul it away. The air chokes him, the filth clings to his skin, and the work is dangerous spit. Walls collapse, disease spreads easily, and one slip could mean injury or death. Duncan's hands are raw, his clothes ragged, and the smell never leaves him, even when he returns to his hut. His wife Elias and their children live with the same shame, marked by the stench that follows their family everywhere. This work wasn't just hard, it was degrading. In medieval Scotland, cesspit workers like Duncan were seen as barely human. Other peasants avoided them, fearing their touch would bring bad luck or disease. The lord's men mocked them, calling them gong farmers, or worse, their laughter cutting deeper than any whip. Even the church, which preached charity, offered little comfort, treating such workers as tainted by their trade. Duncan's family lived on the edge of the village, their hut shunned, their children teased or beaten by others. The isolation was as heavy as the work itself, a constant reminder that they were less than everyone else. Their lives defined by the filth they handled. Yet, these workers were essential. Without them, the castle would choke on its own waste, disease would spread, and the lord's comfortable life would grind to a halt. The irony was cruel. Duncan's work kept the feudal system running, but he was despised for it. The lord needed clean privies to host feasts, the knights needed healthy conditions to train, and the priests needed a sanitary church to pray. Duncan made all this possible, but he was invisible, his labor taken for granted. If he fell ill or died, another outcast would take his place, the system rolling on without a pause. This was the feudal world at its harshest to place, where the lowest were vital, but valued less than the animals they fed. The Viking raids had set the stage for this oppression. The need for defense created lords who demanded absolute control, turning free farmers into serfs and pushing the most desperate into jobs like Duncan's. The raids also left a legacy of fear and scarcity, making society more rigid, more divided. Before the Vikings, communities shared labor, even the dirty tasks, as part of survival. But the feudal system, hardened by the need to rebuild after raids, sorted people into roles that defined their worth. Cesspit workers like Duncan were at the bottom. There lives a mirror of the suffering the Vikings left behind, not from axes, but from a society that normalized cruelty in a different form. Duncan's day began in darkness, long before the castle woke. He'd trudge to the privy pits, his wooden bucket and shovel his only tools. The work was grueling, hours spent in tight, damp spaces, breathing air that burned his lungs. Rats scurried around him, and the risk of falling or getting sick was constant. If he didn't clear enough waste, the Lord Steward might beat him or take food from his family. Once the pits were cleaned, Duncan hauled the waste to a distant field or river, his body aching under the weight. By the time he returned to his hut, the village was awake, but no one greeted him. His children hid their faces when other kids pointed and laughed. Elias scrubbed his clothes, but the stench lingered, a mark they couldn't escape. Food was scarce for Duncan's family. As a cesspit worker, he earned no wages. Only a small share of the Lord's scraps, moldy bread, spoiled vegetables, maybe a bone with a bit of meat. Hunger was a constant ache, and winter was the worst, when even the scraps ran low. Disease was a bigger threat. Working in filth, Duncan was exposed to every kind of sickness, from fevers to skin infections. If he fell ill, there was no help no healer would touch a gong farmer. His children, weakened by hunger, were just as vulnerable. Elias prayed daily, but the church offered little beyond sermons about accepting suffering as God's will. The social stigma was a wound as deep as hunger. Duncan's family was shunned, their hut on the village's edge a symbol of their place. Other peasants, struggling themselves, still saw Duncan as lower, his work a stain on his soul. Children threw stones at his son, calling him filth boy. Elias was ignored at the village well, her water drawn last, if at all. Even death offered no dignity. Cesspit workers were buried in unmarked graves, far from the churchyard. Duncan felt this rejection every day, a reminder that his work, though necessary, made him less than human in the eyes of his world. But Duncan's story isn't just about suffering, it's about resilience. Despite the filth, the scorn, the hunger, he found ways to hold on to his humanity. At night, he carved small wooden figures for his children, a horse, a bird, his rough hands gentle as he shaped the wood. Elias sang to their daughter, her voice soft but strong, weaving stories of a better world. On rare nights they shared a laugh by their small fire, finding joy in each other when the world gave none. These moments were small but powerful, a defiance of the system that tried to crush them. Duncan's kindness to his family, his refusal to let despair win, was a quiet rebellion against a world that saw him as nothing. The church and lords justified this suffering, saying it was God's order. Lords ruled, peasants worked, and outcasts like Duncan bore the lowest burdens. But Duncan sometimes wondered why God allowed such cruelty, why his children starved while the Lord feasted. These questions had no answers, but they showed a spark of resistance, a refusal to accept his place without thought. Other outcasts shared this quiet defiance, sharing food, helping each other through sickness, or hiding a bit of grain from the Lord's men. These acts, small as they were a way of reclaiming dignity in a world that tried to take it away. The Viking raids had created this world, not just through destruction, but by forcing society to value strength and control above all else. The lords who rose to fight raiders became oppressors, their castles built on the labor of people like Duncan. The church, scarred by Viking fires, demanded obedience, turning faith into a tool of control. The fear and division left by the raids hardened into a system that kept the lowest down, their lives a shadow of the terror that started it all. Yet, in Duncan's carved toys, in Elias's songs, there was hope, a stubborn refusal to let the world's cruelty define them. As we move forward, we'll see how the Vikings' own strategies mirrored this systematic oppression, their raids as calculated as the feudal order that followed. For now, hold on to the image of Duncan sitting by his fire, carving a wooden horse for his son, his hands steady despite the filth, his heart holding on to love in a world that offered none. This is the story of the lowest rungs of society, a tale of dehumanization, endurance, and the quiet strength that kept the outcasts of medieval Scotland alive. Duncan Malloud sits by his small fire, his calloused hands carefully carving a wooden horse for his son, a flicker of love in a world that offers him none. The feudal system that traps him, born from the chaos of Viking raids, weighs heavy on his shoulders. Its roots in a time when terror came from the sea. But the Vikings who shaped this oppressive order weren't wild barbarians, swinging axes in a frenzy. They were planners, strategists, masters of a brutal craft. Their raids, which tore through Europe for nearly 3 centuries, were not random acts of violence, but carefully orchestrated campaigns designed to maximize wealth, fear, and destruction. Let's step back from Duncan's fire, my friends, and sail into the minds of the Vikings, to uncover the systematic strategies that made their raids so devastating and left a legacy that still chains people like Duncan to a life of hardship. The Viking raids, stretching from the late 700s to the early 1000s, were like a storm that hit with precision, not chaos. When those dragon-headed longships appeared on the horizon, they weren't just boats carrying warriors. They were the result of weeks, sometimes months of planning. The Vikings didn't strike blindly. They chose their targets with care, knowing exactly where to hit for the most gain. Monasteries like Lindisfarne, villages along rivers, or trading posts filled with goods, these weren't random choices. They were scouted, studied, and attacked at the perfect moment. This wasn't just raiding, it was a business, a deadly operation run with the efficiency of a modern army. Imagine a Viking chieftain, let's call him Sigurd, standing on the deck of his longship as it cuts through the North Sea. Before setting sail, Sigurd and his men have done their homework. They've talked to traders, listened to rumors, or even sent scouts to watch a target for days. They know the monastery at Iona has silver chalices and no guards. They know a village on the Seine River is busy with a harvest festival, its people distracted. They know the tides and winds will carry them in at dawn, when defenses are weakest. Sigurd's men aren't just warriors, they're navigators, spies, and planners, each with a role in the raid. This preparation made the Vikings unstoppable, turning a simple attack into a masterpiece of destruction. When the longships landed, the raid unfolded like a well-rehearsed play. Picture Sigurd's crew hitting a coastal village in Ireland. As the boats touch shore, some men stay behind to guard them, tying ropes to rocks and keeping weapons ready for a quick escape. Others fan out, moving silently to surround the village and block escape routes. A small group, maybe the fiercest warriors or berserkers, leads the attack, their war cries shattering the morning quiet. These roles weren't random. Every man knew his job, trained to act fast and without hesitation. The Vikings moved like a pack of wolves, each part of the group working together to corner their prey. This organization turned a band of raiders into a force that could overwhelm entire communities in minutes. The Vikings' greatest weapon wasn't their axes or ships, it was fear. They didn't just want to steal, they wanted to terrify. Before they even landed, their reputation did the work for them. Stories of burned monasteries and slaughtered villagers spread faster than their longships, making people surrender without a fight. Sigurd and his men knew this and used it to their advantage. They shouted war cries, banged shields, and lit fires to create panic before the attack began. They left bodies where they'd be found, sometimes mutilated in gruesome ways, like the Blood Eagle, to ensure survivors carried tales of horror to the next village. This wasn't just violence, it was theater designed to break the will of entire regions. Let's imagine a raid on a small monastery in Scotland. The monks are praying, unaware of the longships gliding up the river. Sigurd's men don't just charge in, they start with fear. They set fire to nearby fields, letting smoke choke the air and signal their arrival. They beat drums and scream, making it seem like an army is coming, not a few dozen men. When they attack, they target the monks first, dragging them from the chapel to show that even God's house isn't safe. They might spare one monk, not out of kindness, but to send him running to the next town, sobbing about the devils from the sea. This fear spread like a plague, making villages empty their treasures at the first sight of a sale, hoping to avoid the Vikings' wrath. The Vikings also targeted their loot with precision. They didn't grab everything, they took what was valuable and easy to carry. Gold and silver from monasteries were obvious prizes, but they also took tools, weapons, and food that could be sold or used. They knew a village's granary was its lifeline, so they burned it to ensure starvation. They stole livestock to weaken farmers and took boats to cripple trade. But their biggest prize was people. Captives were a walking profit. sold in slave markets across Europe and beyond. A strong man could work in fields or mines. A woman could serve in a household. A child could be raised to obey. The Vikings didn't see these people as families. They saw them as goods, as valuable as gold. A single raid could net dozens of captives, each one sold for silver in places like Dublin or Constantinople. This economic strategy was ruthless, but effective. By targeting monasteries and villages, the Vikings hit the heart of medieval wealth. Monasteries weren't just rich, they were banks, holding gold and silver for entire regions. Villages were economic hubs, producing food and goods for trade. When the Vikings burned a granary or stole a herd, they didn't just take resources, they crippled the community's ability to survive. They targeted mills to stop flour production, boats to end fishing, and tools to halt farming. This wasn't just looting, it was sabotaged, designed to leave survivors too weak to rebuild. The slave trade added to the devastation, stripping villages of their workforce and leaving fields unplanted, markets empty, and families broken. The Vikings' cultural targeting was just as deliberate. They didn't just steal from monasteries, they destroyed their spirit. By burning sacred books and smashing altars, they attacked the heart of Christian faith. To the people of the time, a monastery was more than a building, it was a connection to God, a place of learning and hope. When the Vikings defiled it, they shook entire communities, making people question their beliefs. They targeted symbols, crosses, relics, carved stones to erase the identity of the places they attacked. This wasn't just about profit. It was about power, about showing that nothing was sacred, not even God's house. What's chilling is how the Vikings could switch from raiders to ordinary men. After a raid, Sigurd might return to his farm in Norway, plow his fields, and hug his children, as if he hadn't just burned a village or sold a family into slavery. This compartmentalization was part of their culture. Raiding was a job, a way to gain wealth and honor, not something to feel guilty about. Back home, a successful raider was a hero, his loot shared with his family, his stories told at feasts. This normalization of violence let the Vikings carry out their brutality without hesitation. Their raids as routine as planting crops. To them, it was just life, but to their victims, it was the end of everything. Let's picture a young woman named Edith, caught in one of Sigurd's raids. She's weaving in her village when the Vikings strike. The fires start, the screams fill the air, and before she can run, she's tied up and dragged to a long ship. Her brother tries to fight, but he's cut down. Her mother is taken too, but they're separated in the chaos. For weeks, Edith is trapped in the ship's hold, cold and terrified, until she's sold in a noisy market far from home. Her life as a weaver is gone, replaced by servitude in a Viking household. Her story, like thousands of others, fueled the Vikings' wealth while leaving her village broken, its economy and spirit shattered. These systematic strategies made the Vikings unstoppable, scouted targets, timed their attacks, and used fear to weaken resistance. They targeted wealth and people, knowing exactly how to cripple a community. They turned violence into a routine, a way of life that built their power while destroying others. The world Duncan Malloud lives in, with its lords and castles, was shaped by this brutality. The feudal system that traps him grew from the need to survive Viking raids, but it adopted their ruthlessness, turning peasants and outcasts into tools of a new kind of oppression. As we move forward, we'll see how these raids left long-term scars on Europe, changing its economy, faith, and way of life for centuries. For now, hold on to the image of Sigurd standing on his long ship, his eyes cold as he plans the next raid, his men moving like shadows, ready to turn another village into ash and memory. This is the systematic strategy of the Vikings, a machine of terror that didn't just destroy but reshape the world, leaving people like Duncan to bear the cost. Sigurd stands on his longship, his eyes cold and calculating as he plans the next raid, his men moving like shadows, ready to turn another village into ash and memory. The Viking raids, with their ruthless precision, didn't just leave burned monasteries and broken lives in their wake. They set off a chain reaction that reshaped Europe for centuries, from the late 700s to the early 1000s. These attacks forced entire societies to adapt, leaving scars that changed how people thought, worked, prayed, and fought. Let's sail beyond the immediate destruction, my friends, and explore the long-term transformation of Europe, a continent remade by fear, resilience, and the echoes of Viking axes. For the raids, goods like wool, wine, and iron flowed freely along rivers and coasts. Monasteries weren't just spiritual centers, they were banks, storing wealth for entire regions. But when those sacred spaces burned, people questioned their faith. Bishops and abbots built fortified cathedrals, their stone walls a symbol of strength. The Vikings changed that, their speed and mobility demanding new defenses. Kings and lords studied Viking ship designs, building faster boats to patrol rivers and coasts. The loss of manuscripts and artifacts, as we saw with Aldred's charred page, created gaps in knowledge that took centuries to fill. Coastal populations dwindled as people fled inland, reshaping where and how people lived. New towns grew around castles, their walls a constant reminder of the Viking threat. These towns became centers of power, drawing people like Cuthbert to trade labor for safety. But in the societies they shaped, influencing everything from feudal oppression to later wars. For now, hold on to the image of a new stone castle rising on a hill. Its walls built by men like Oswin. Its gates guarding a Europe forever changed by the Viking raids, a continent, scarred but stronger. Its people shaped by fear, but driven by an unyielding will to endure. The slave trade, meanwhile, scattered Europeans across the world, from Ireland to the Middle East, changing the makeup of entire regions. Some areas never recovered their populations, their lands left fallow, their histories erased. Others grew stronger, their fortified settlements laying the foundation for medieval cities. But the raids also forced Europe to adapt, preserving what it could in new ways. The raids created a sense of us versus them, uniting Christians against a common enemy. This unity, born of fear, strengthened kingdoms like England and Francia as kings rallied their people to fight. But it also made Europe more insular, less open to outsiders. The trust that once linked coastal communities through trade was replaced by suspicion, as every stranger could be a Viking spy. This mindset lingered, shaping a Europe that was more divided, more defensive, its people hardened by centuries of fear. Monks began hiding manuscripts in secret vaults or copying them in safer inland monasteries. Artisans developed new styles, simpler but stronger, to replace what was lost. This resilience kept culture alive even if it was changed. The Vikings themselves, settling in places like England and Normandy, brought their own traditions, shipbuilding, storytelling, craftsmanship that blended with local cultures, creating new identities. They developed new tactics, like ambushing raiders on narrow rivers, or using cavalry to chase them down. These innovations weren't just about fighting Vikings, they changed warfare itself, making it more mobile, more strategic. The warrior class that emerged, as we saw with Godric's sons, became the knights of the feudal age, their skills honed by the Viking threat. They built walls, fought back, and found ways to preserve their faith and culture. Monks copied books in secret, lords trained warriors, and farmers shared what little they had. These acts of defiance, small and large, kept Europe alive, even as it changed. The Vikings forced a reckoning, but they also revealed the strength of those who survived. Their determination to rebuild a world that could withstand the storm. Castles and militias became the backbone of medieval Europe, their origins in the fear of dragon-headed ships. Lords built stronger castles, moving from wood to stone to withstand fire and siege. They trained larger militias, turning farmers into fighters. Let's picture a young man named Oswin, a farmer's son who joins his lord's militia, learns to use a spear, builds walls around his village, and stands watch for Viking sails. His life, once tied to the plow, is now about defense, his skills shaped by the need to survive. They demanded more tithes, claiming the money was needed to rebuild and protect. For peasants like Duncan Maud, this meant giving up even more of their meager harvests, deepening their poverty. The church's new militancy also led to a loss of sacred relics, crosses, bones, and artifacts, stolen or destroyed by Vikings. These losses weakened the spiritual connection people felt, as relics were seen as links to God. New churches were built farther inland, away from Viking reach, changing the religious landscape of Europe. Why had God let this happen? Was it punishment? These doubts led to a more militant Christianity, one that saw fighting as a way to defend the faith. Priests began preaching about holy wars, planting seeds for the crusades that would come later. Let's imagine a priest named Father Edric, who survives a raid on his monastery. He rebuilds a small stone church, but his sermons are no longer about forgiveness. They're about standing firm against enemies, sword in hand. This shift made religion more defensive, more tied to the struggles of a violent world. When Vikings looted places like Lindisfarne or Iona, they didn't just take gold, they disrupted the flow of money. Villages that depended on monastic trade struggled, their economies crumbling. The slave trade, a grim Viking enterprise, drained communities of their workforce, leaving fields unplanted and workshops empty. Entire regions became poorer, their people forced to scrape by with less, their lives shaped by scarcity rather than abundance. But Viking longships made travel dangerous, forcing merchants to stick to safer, shorter routes. Towns that relied on trade shrank or vanished, their markets replaced by small, self-sufficient villages. People like Cuthbert stopped trading with distant lands and focused on growing enough to survive. This economic retrenchment made Europe more local, more isolated as communities turned inward, relying on what they could produce themselves. The raids didn't just destroy, they left a deep psychological mark on Europe, like a wound that never fully healed. Imagine living in a coastal village, knowing that any day could bring dragon-headed ships. Let's picture a fisherman named Cuthbert, who once lived by the North Sea, his nets full of cod. After a Viking raid burns his village, he packs up his family and moves to a hilltop settlement, far from the water. His life as a fisherman is gone, replaced by scratching a living from rocky soil. This shift happened across Europe, from Ireland to Francia, as entire populations fled the coasts. The map of Europe changed, with new villages sprouting inland and old ones left as ruins. Their harbors empty, their names forgotten. Fear wasn't just about the attack itself, but the constant dread of it happening again. People developed what we might now call collective trauma, a shared anxiety that seeped into every part of life. Villages built warning systems, beacons on hills, watchtowers by the sea to spot Vikings early. Families slept with one eye open, ready to flee at the sound of a horn. Children grew up hearing stories of slaughter, their nightmares filled with longships and fire. This wasn't just fear, it was a new way of living, where safety was never certain, and every stranger could be a threat. This psychological toll changed how communities functioned. Coastal areas, once bustling with trade and fishing, were abandoned as people moved inland, seeking safety behind hills or castle walls. The economic impact was just as profound. The Vikings' attacks on trade routes and markets, as we saw with merchants like Leofwin, broke the networks that kept Europe connected. The loss of monasteries, as we explored earlier, was a blow to Europe's economy as well as its culture. Religion, too, was transformed by the raids. Before the Vikings, Christianity was a religion of peace, its monasteries places of prayer and learning. The church also became more powerful, using the Viking threat to justify its control. Militarily, the Viking raids forced Europe to innovate. Before the raids, most communities had little need for armies. Kings fought wars, but villages relied on a few guards. The Vikings' own technology, those sleek, fast longships, pushed Europe to improve its own. The Vikings' raids also left a cultural legacy, one that was both destructive and transformative. The demographic shifts caused by the raids were long-lasting. The Vikings' influence went beyond destruction. They changed how Europe saw itself. Yet in this transformation, there was resilience. People like Cuthbert, Father Edric, and Oswin adapted to their new world. As we move forward, we'll see how the Vikings' brutality became normalized, not just in their own culture. A stone castle rises on a hill, its walls built by men like Oswin, its gates guarding a Europe forever changed by the Viking raids. The scars of those raids burned villages, lost lives. Shattered faith have hardened into a new world, one of fortified towns, warrior lords, and a faith that fights back. But what's chilling is how this brutality was just a tactic. It was a cultural norm for the Vikings. To them, raiding wasn't evil. It was honorable, a path to wealth, status, and glory. Their raids forced Europe to adopt their ways, creating a society where violence was not just accepted, but expected. The feudal system, born from the need to defend against Viking attacks, turned brutality into a structure. Lords like the one ruling over Duncan Malaud used force to control their serfs, beating those who didn't pay taxes or worked too slowly. Survivors of raids, desperate to protect themselves, learned to fight like their attackers. Villages formed militias, copying the Vikings' speed and surprise tactics. The Viking Age taught Europe that strength and fear were power. Peasants like Duncan Loud lived in a world where violence was everywhere, not just from lords but from the constant threat of war, rebellion, or new raiders. The fear of Vikings had faded, but the fear of punishment, hunger, or death remained. Duncan's life spent cleaning cesspits or plowing fields, shaped by a system that saw his suffering as normal, even necessary. The church told him to accept it, the Lord enforced it, society expected it. For now, hold on to the image of Duncan carving that wooden horse, his hands steady despite the world's weight. And Sigurd, standing on his longship, his eyes blind to the pain he caused. This is the normalization of brutality, a story of how Viking raids didn't just break Europe, but taught it to embrace the very violence it feared, leaving a legacy that shaped centuries to come. The brutality of the Vikings hadn't disappeared, had been absorbed, repackaged into the rules of feudal life. Kings and lords, inspired by Viking tactics, used violence to expand their territories, crush rebellions, and control their people. People like Duncan found ways to push back, not with swords, but with small acts of defiance. He carved toys for his children, giving them joy in a world that offered none. His wife, Elia, sang stories of freedom, keeping hope alive. Villagers shared food, helped each other rebuild, or hid crops from the Lord's men. These acts, tiny as they were a refusal to let brutality define them. They showed that even in a world where violence was normal, humanity could still shine through, a quiet rebellion against a system that tried to crush it. This mindset carried into later centuries, influencing wars, conquests, and even colonization. In Scandinavia, sagas celebrated men like Sigurd as heroes, their violence romanticized as courage. Their raids didn't just destroy, they taught Europe to live with violence, to see it as a tool of power, faith, and survival. The feudal system that trapped Duncan, the militant faith that shaped Father Edric, the wars that Beorn Fotal carried the Vikings' mark. This wasn't just a change in laws or borders, it was a change in how people saw the world, where strength justified suffering and fear was a way of life. Even in Europe, Viking tales grew larger than life. Their brutality softened into tales of adventure. By the time Duncan's grandchildren were born, Vikings were no longer just raiders. They were figures of myth, their cruelty celebrated as strength. This romanticization hid the pain of people like Edith, sold into slavery, or Sinberg, mourning her lost daughter. It turned trauma into legend, making it harder to see the true cost of their actions. The Vikings' legacy was not just in their raids, but in how they taught Europe to see violence as a solution. By the time Europeans sailed to new worlds, their ships carried not just explorers, but the same ruthless ambition that drove Viking longships conquer, take, and dominate. Kings built fleets inspired by longships, using them to patrol rivers and coasts. This wasn't just defense, it was a kind of cultural Stockholm syndrome where the victims began to mirror their oppressors. Let's imagine a young warrior named Beorn, trained to fight Vikings. He learns to strike fast, to use fear, to take no prisoners, a tactics he learned from watching Viking raids. When he defends his village, he fights like a Viking, his violence praised as heroism. The line between defender and raider blurs as Europe internalizes the brutality it once feared. The church, once a beacon of peace, preached that suffering was God's will, justifying the Lord's harsh rule. This militant Christianity grew, normalizing violence as a tool of faith. By the 11th century, the church was blessing knights to fight, not just Vikings but other enemies. Their swords seen as instruments of God. This mindset laid the groundwork for the Crusades, where violence was sanctified as a holy mission. The Vikings' attacks on monasteries, once seen as sacrilege, had pushed the church to embrace the very brutality it condemned, turning faith into a weapon. Peasants like Duncan, scraping by in hunger and toil, were told their pain was divine, their place at the bottom fixed by heaven. This was a new kind of brutality, not from axes, but from a system that made oppression routine. Imagine Sigurd returning to his village in Norway, his longship loaded with gold and slaves. The Lord's castle looms over the fields, its walls a reminder of the Viking threat that birthed it. Inside, the Lord dines on meat and wine, while peasants like Duncan starve. If Duncan fails to deliver his share of grain, the Lord's men whip him, their blows as calculated as a Viking's axe. The priest, standing in a stone church built to withstand raids, tells Duncan this suffering is God's plan, that obedience will earn him salvation. The violence of the Vikings, once a shock, has been woven into the rules of this world, where lords and priests enforce control with fear, just as the Vikings did. He's not shunned as a killer, he's celebrated as a hero. In places like Normandy in England, Viking raiders settled, trading longships for castles. Men like Sigurd's sons became lords, their families blending into the feudal order. But they brought their culture of violence with them. These new rulers used the same ruthless tactics: force, fear, and punishment to keep power. In England, the Viking-founded Danelaw saw Norse laws mix with local ones, codifying harsh penalties for disobedience. A thief might lose a hand, a rebel might be executed, their deaths a public spectacle to keep others in line. This wasn't Viking raiding anymore, it was Viking brutality, normalized into the laws and customs of a new society. His neighbors feast in his honor, his children listen wide-eyed to his tales of conquest, and his loot lifts his family's standing. Raiding was as normal to him as plowing fields was to Duncan, a job that defined his worth in a culture that prized strength above all else. But the Vikings didn't just reshape Europe's landscape. They left a deeper mark, one that seeped into its soul. Raiding wasn't just about survival, it was a way to prove courage, to earn a place in songs and sagas. A Viking who burned a monastery or enslaved a village wasn't seen as cruel. It was seen as successful, his violence a badge of honor. This mindset let men like Sigurd kill without guilt, loot without remorse, and sell captives like livestock. They could return home, hug their families, and sleep soundly. Their brutality compartmentalized as just another part of life. This acceptance of violence was what made the Vikings so effective and so terrifying. Their brutality, once a shocking storm, became a way of life, not just for the Vikings, but for the societies they touched. Let's walk through this transformed world, my friends, and see how the violence of the raids became normalized, woven into the fabric of medieval Europe, from the fields of peasants like Duncan, loud to the thrones of kings, leaving a legacy that echoed far beyond the last longship. The Viking raids, from the late 700s to the early 1000s, were a masterclass in calculated terror, as we saw with Sigurd's meticulously planned attacks. This normalization came from the Vikings' world. Scandinavia's harsh lands, with their rocky soil and long winters, pushed men to seek wealth beyond their shores. But the normalization of brutality didn't stop with the Vikings. Let's picture a village in Scotland, a generation after the worst Viking raids. The Vikings' influence went further, as their descendants became part of Europe's ruling class. Even more unsettling was how Europe's people began to adopt Viking ways. The church, too, absorbed this violence. The raids had shaken Christian faith, as we saw with priests like Father Edric preaching holy wars. The normalization of brutality also shaped Europe's future conflicts. For ordinary people, this normalization was a heavy burden. Yet even in this world, there was resistance. The Vikings' brutality also left a cultural paradox. Their raids were horrific, but their stories became legends. The normalization of brutality was the Vikings' deepest legacy. As we move to our conclusion, we'll reflect on what this brutal legacy means for us today, asking how we confront humanity's capacity for cruelty and celebrate resilience over violence. Duncan Maloud carves a wooden horse by his fire, his steady hands shaping a small gift of love for his son. While far away, Sigurd stands on his longship, his eyes cold, blind to the pain his raids have caused. These two images, Duncan's quiet resilience and Sigurd's ruthless ambition, capture the heart of the Viking Age, a time when brutality reshaped Europe, leaving scars that lasted centuries. We've walked through burned villages, stood with trembling survivors, and seen how the Vikings' calculated terror became a way of life, woven into the feudal systems, militant faiths, and hardened societies that followed. The Vikings' longships didn't just carry warriors, they carried a new way of seeing the world. Think of Sinberg, standing in the ashes of her village, mourning her lost daughter, but finding the strength to keep going. Yet their actions forced Europe to adapt, creating a stronger, more fortified world. The castles that rose to stop them became the centers of medieval power. The Vikings weren't monsters, they were men, shaped by their world, driven by a culture that saw violence as honor. They weren't so different from the lords who oppressed Duncan, or the priests who justified suffering, or even the Europeans who adopted their tactics to survive. The Viking raids teach us to look at our own world with clear eyes. The flames have long since died, the screams faded into history. Think of Sinberg, searching the sea for her daughter. Think of Aldred, saving a fragment of his manuscript. Think of Duncan, carving a horse for his son. Think of Sigurd, blind to the pain he caused, a reminder of what we can become if we let violence define us. The Viking raids are gone, but their lessons linger. Let's choose to honor the strength of the survivors, to tell their stories, and to build a world where hope, not brutality, is what we pass on. Thank you for walking this path with me. Let's keep seeking the truths that history holds together. But the echoes remain in the stone castles, the feudal fields, the militant faith, and the stories we tell. The Viking Age was a time of terror, but it was also a time of survival, of people who faced the worst and still found ways to live, love, and hope. Their resilience is our inheritance, a call to choose compassion over cruelty, to build a world where no one is left in the ashes. We live in a time where violence is still normalized, in systems of power and stories we tell ourselves. We celebrate warriors, leaders, and conquerors, often forgetting the cost of their victories. The Vikings' legacy asks us to question this, to ask who pays the price for power, and why we glorify those who take it. It challenges us to honor the forgotten, the Sinbergs and Duncans whose stories were never written down, whose strength held their world together. Their story shows us humanity's capacity for cruelty, how easily we can normalize violence when it serves our needs. Whether it's a Viking burning a village or a lord beating a serf, the pattern is the same: power built on pain, justified as necessary, even noble. The warriors trained to fight them became the knights of legend. They rebuilt, they loved, they hoped, even when the world gave them no reason to. Their resilience is a lesson for us today, a reminder that no matter how dark things get, we can find ways to endure. Their small acts of defiance, sharing a crust of bread, carving a toy, singing a song, were victories against a system that tried to break them. They show us that humanity's heart is stronger than its cruelty, that compassion can outlast violence. The faith they challenged grew fiercer, shaping a Christianity that carried Europe through centuries of conflict. Even the Vikings themselves, settling in places like Normandy in England, left their mark, blending their shipbuilding, storytelling, and courage into the cultures they once attacked. But this strength came at a terrible cost: lives lost, families torn apart, knowledge burned, and a society hardened by fear. Think of Aldred, the monk clutching a charred manuscript page, determined to save what little knowledge he could. Think of Godric trading freedom for safety, but teaching his sons to fight for their home. And think of Duncan, carving a wooden horse for his son despite the filth and scorn of his life as a cesspit worker. These people, ordinary and forgotten, were the heart of this story. Their resilience, their small acts of love and defiance, kept humanity alive in a world that tried to crush it. They rebuilt homes, shared food, told stories, and held on to hope, proving that even in the darkest times, the human spirit could shine through. Coastal villages, once open and trusting, became fortified towns, their people always watching the sea. Faith, once a source of peace, turned militant, with priests preaching holy wars and churches built like fortresses. In their own sagas, men like Sigurd were heroes. Their raids turned into tales of glory. In Europe, too, their story was romanticized over time, their violence softened into myths of adventure. We see this today in movies and shows that paint Vikings as noble warriors, ignoring the pain of people like Edith, sold into slavery, or Sinberg, left with nothing but grief. This romanticization hides the truth, making it easy to forget the human cost of their actions. It's a reminder that history can twist pain into pride, turning oppressors into legends while the voices of their victims fade. Economies shrank as trade routes died, forcing communities to scrape by on their own. And the feudal system, born to protect against Vikings, became a machine of control, grinding down people like Duncan into lives of toil and shame. The Vikings' violence didn't just destroy, taught Europe to live with brutality, to see it as a tool of power, faith, and survival. And now, my friends, let us step back and reflect on what this grim chapter of history tells us about humanity's capacity for cruelty, strength to endure, and the choices we make to celebrate one over the other. This is the story of the Viking raid's legacy, a tale that asks us to look at our own world with clear eyes and open hearts. The Viking raids, from the late 700s to the early 1000s, were more than just attacks. They were a force that changed Europe forever. We began with the shock of Lindisfarne in 793, where dragon-headed ships brought fire and death to a peaceful monastery. We saw the Vikings' calculated brutality, their raids planned like a deadly dance, targeting wealth, people, and hope itself. We walked through the human cost, with people like Sinberg and Edith losing families and freedom, their lives torn apart by a violence that left no one untouched. We explored the economic and cultural destruction as monasteries burned and trade collapsed, erasing knowledge and wealth that took centuries to rebuild. We saw how these raids forced Europe to transform, building walls, warriors, and a feudal system that trapped peasants like Duncan in a new kind of oppression. And we traced how the Vikings' brutality became normalized. It's not just in their own sagas, but in the societies they shaped, influencing everything from feudal rule to the Crusades. This journey has shown us a Europe remade by fear. But this story isn't just about cruelty, it's about the people who endured it. The Vikings' legacy is a paradox. Their raids were horrific, their brutality a stain on history. What's unsettling is how the Vikings' brutality became celebrated. This brings us to a hard question. What does the Viking Age tell us about ourselves? But the story also shows us humanity's strength. The survivors of the Viking raids, Sinberg, Aldred, Godric, Duncan, faced horrors we can barely imagine, yet they kept going. So what do we take from this? As we close this journey, let's return to the shores where it began. To that foggy morning in 793, when the first Viking longships appeared at Lindisfarne. So, my friends, wherever you are, whether in a bustling city or a quiet village, take a moment to think of those who came before.